Hi, and welcome to this section of the Pre-Algebra Tutor. And in this section, we're going to do something just as important as what we covered in the last section. The topic in this section is titled Subtracting Integers. So you know that integers are basically negative and positive numbers, just like we were doing in the last section. No decimal points, they're just the whole numbers, but they're negative, positive, and also zero. So instead of adding them, here we'll be subtracting them. But let me let you in on a little secret. I didn't really tell you this too much last section, but you've already been doing subtraction of integers, really. I mean, there's a couple of new things that we'll need to learn in this section, one case that you've never seen before, but really you've been subtracting integers already. And so let me give you a couple of examples of that, just to kind of give you a little bit of motivation. Remember in the last section when we were adding integers, if I gave you something like 6 plus -3, you know how to do that, right? Because basically, I taught you that anytime you're adding something together, if one of them is positive and one of them is negative, you always have to do a subtraction because one of these guys is negative. So I told you, go ahead and subtract the numbers. It doesn't matter if the order is flipped, you're just still going to subtract the numbers and you're going to get the answer of 3. And the sign of the answer is always going to come from the larger absolute value. So this is positive, so it's positive 3. And I also taught you there toward the end of the section that anytime you have something plus a negative something else, this plus negative business here, it's exactly the same thing as just putting a minus sign in there. And then you already know that 6 minus 3 also gives you 3. So they're both very consistent. Sometimes you might see something written like this, especially when it's not really numbers. When you have variables, letters running around everywhere, then it would be very common for you to see, a plus negative b or something like that, or negative times some other expression that's going to be off over here on the other side, that has letters in there. But when it's numbers, it kind of looks a little silly to put plus minus, because when you think about what you're doing there, I'm adding something to the number 6, but I'm not adding a big number. I'm not adding a positive number. I'm actually adding something that has kind of like a deficit associated with it. In other words, a negative number is when I owe you something else. So I may have had 6 pencils, but I'm adding to that the fact that I owe somebody else something else. So I'm not really adding a number that's making it larger. I'm adding something that I need to end up taking away anyway. And so that's why when you add a negative number, it's the same thing as just subtracting the number. That's sort of the best way I can explain it. And so you need to get in the habit of anytime you see plus negative, it is subtraction. And so I just wanted to kind of show you that because you've already been doing subtraction of integers, really. There's a few cases we need to think about, obviously, that you haven't seen before, but you've been doing it. So take a deep breath. Some people find this difficult, but I'm going to break it down for you so that it's not difficult. All right, so let's look just like we've been doing before. Let's look at a few different cases and break it down just like we've been doing before. So let's say you have a positive number. Subtract from that another positive number, right? So what would be some examples that would fall into this bucket? Well, these would be examples you've seen all your life. Here's a positive number 4 minus 2, which is another positive number. And the answer to that is 2. I mean, these are not rocket science. 3 minus 1 also gives you 2. 6 minus 3, we just did that one, gives you 3. So when you have a positive number and you subtract a positive number, right? In these cases that I have here on the board, these are just regular subtraction problems from first grade. So it's not like you haven't seen this kind of thing before. You just do the normal subtraction as usual. But notice that I didn't really tell you this in the beginning, but I'll point out now that the particular problems I picked here are special because look at these numbers here. All of these numbers here that are first in all these problems, these are, in these cases I put on the board, these are larger. And these guys here that we're subtracting from, or that we're subtracting from the other number, from the larger number, these are smaller. So you already know that if you have a bigger number like 5 and you subtract 2 from it, you can easily do that with marbles or whatever and you can get the answer, larger minus smaller. That's what we learned in first grade. So you've been subtracting integers. However, when you get into algebra, it's perfectly okay to have a smaller number and subtract the bigger number from it, right? Now, when you were in first grade, you were told that that couldn't happen. If I had 5 pencils, I can't subtract from it, 20 pencils. If I have 2 sticks of butter, I cannot subtract from that 6 more sticks of butter. It's impossible because I don't have that many sticks of butter to begin with. Well, that makes total sense for physical sticks of butter. You can't take more away than what you had. But in algebra and the concept of negative number, you can totally do that subtraction, and you'll be doing it every day of the week from here on out in pre-algebra and algebra 1 and algebra 2 and on, forever. Okay? So how do you do that? What does that mean to do that kind of subtraction? Let's explore that. Let's say we're still going to subtract positive minus positive, but let's pick some different problems. Let's pick some problems where things are a little bit reversed. Let's say we had 3 and we're going to subtract from it 4. This is the kind of problem that in basic math, second grade, you would never see it because it doesn't make any sense. Because if I have 3 sticks, I can't subtract 4 sticks from it. However, I'm going to tell you the answer is -1. And I think you'll be able to understand that from this problem. If I only have 3 sticks, let's do it like this. I have 3 markers in my hand, right? And I want to take 4 of them away. Well, in basic math, you would say, well, that's impossible. I only have 3 of them. But in algebra and in higher math, I would say, okay, I want to take 4 of these away. Okay, here's one I'm taking away. Here's the second one I'm taking away. Here's the third one I'm taking away. I have none left, but I need to take 1 more. So then I'll just say, okay, I have -1 markers. Because I tried to take the last one away, but I don't have any. So the only thing I can do is owe you 1 marker. Because I don't have any. So I owe you 1. And remember, negative numbers is like owing you something. That's basically what they are. So that is exactly what the concept of negative numbers really are. And this is how they arise. When you try to do a subtraction like this, when you have a smaller number minus a bigger number, you're going to get a negative answer. So if you wanted to show that graphically, which I think is a really good idea, then if you were going to draw a little number line, you would put it like that. And we started at the number 3, so here's 0, here's 1, here's 2, and here's 3. And let's put -1 over here. And then let's say I was going to do this subtraction. So I'm starting at the number 3, so I'm going to put a little dot here. I'm going to put a little arrow to remind you, to tell you that I'm starting here. Right? And I need to take away 4. Now, since I'm subtracting 4, I'm going to go this way on the number line, smaller on the number line. 1, 2, 3, 4. And I land right here on -1. And this is why, because I take these markers away, eventually when I get here I have to take 1 more. That's okay, I'm just going to owe you a marker. So next time I go to the store and buy markers, I'll have 1, I can give it back to you. So you're just keeping track of it, with the sign, basically. So you're doing that. Now the other thing I want to point out to you that's just as important is that we've actually sort of been doing this already in the last section, in the section on adding integers. Because remember, and I'll just draw a little line here. Remember, what if I gave you the problem 3 plus -4? 3 plus a -4. Well, I told you that the way you would handle this, because you're adding these things together and you have different signs, anytime you're adding something and you have different signs like that, you're going to need to end up subtracting the numbers. So I told you, I said, all right, go ahead and subtract them. 4 minus 3 gives you 1, and the sign is going to come from the larger absolute value. This is the larger absolute value number, so it's -1. So you see, this has already been done before, and I also told you just a minute ago, up here at the top, that anytime you have plus and negative, it's the same thing as just having a negative. Right? So this guy right here, that's one thing you really need to just get used to seeing. If you see plus a negative number, you don't need to really write it like that. I mean, you'll see it in your books a lot because they're trying to teach you the concept of adding and subtracting and multiplying and dividing negative and positive numbers. So you'll see this plus negative business a lot. But in real algebra, when you get a little bit farther, you really won't see this very much because this is really the exact same thing as just subtracting. Right? So you see plus negative, you're going to end up subtracting those things together. So everything that we've covered so far, I'm going to give you some more examples. These cases, certainly you've seen them in first grade, so that's already been done. These cases here, when you're still subtracting positive minus positive, but you've got the smaller number, it's the same thing as adding a negative number, which you've already covered in the last section. You know how to do that, right? And I'm trying to give you some graphical tools to show you why it's the case, but we've done it before. You'll find out in a minute when I give you the next case, we've done that one before too. There's really only one case at the end of this section that you've really never seen before. So I could have, if I wanted to, combine this addition and subtraction of integers into one section on this course, but I wanted to split it up to make it totally clear. So I guess what I'm trying to tell you is you've done a lot of this stuff even if you don't realize it. Now let's go and do another one. Let's say I have 1 minus 3. What's that going to equal? Well, I'm going to tell you that it's going to equal negative 2, and then we'll talk about why. Because here I have one marker, right? And I'm trying to subtract from it 3 markers. But I don't have 3 markers, so I only have 1. So I subtract the 1. Okay, now I have to subtract 2 more, but I don't have any more. So I don't have them, but I need to subtract them. So I'm just going to end up owing you those 2 markers. And that's why the answer is negative 2. And if you wanted to look on a number line, which at this stage of the game, just learning algebra, drawing number lines is a very good idea because you'll always get the right answer. And you'll never get confused. So here's 0, 1, 2, 3, negative 1, negative 2. So we'll label negative 1, negative 2, 1, 2, 3. So if we did this, we're going to start at positive 1, and we're going to go backwards 3. 1, 2, 3. I owe you 2 pencils, and that's why we have the negative 2 there. And then also just to kind of drill it in a little bit more, this is exactly the same thing as what we did in the very last section. It's the same thing as 1 plus a negative 3. Because we have plus negative, that's equal to 1 minus 3, which I've just shown you as negative 2. So sort of the, well actually before I get to that, let me just do one more real quick. We'll do one more of these sort of explanation problems, and then I'll summarize something for you. 5 minus 8. Okay, well, I'm going to, if you can visualize a number line even before I draw it, right? Actually, I changed my mind. Let me go ahead and draw it. Let's say we have the number line here, just to kind of show you graphically. We're going to start at the number 5. So here's 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. This is number 5 on the number line. All right, and this is negative 1, negative 2, negative 3. Negative 1, negative 2, negative 3. And let's say I start on this number line at positive 5, because that's where I'm starting, and I have to take away 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I land on negative 3. So the answer is negative 3. And again, it makes total sense. If I have 5 markers in my hand, but I need to take 8 away, let's do it. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't have any more markers, but I need to keep subtracting. I need to take away 3 more. 6, 7, 8. I owe you 3 more markers. Negative 3. That's why it's negative. The number line is just a nice, convenient way to write that down. And of course, in the same notation as the last section, it's exactly the same thing as 5 plus a negative 8, right? Because plus a negative is the same thing as subtraction. 5 minus 8, right? Now, this is, I think, an excellent way to do it. You don't want to always draw this number line. You want to do it in the beginning to understand it, but it's a great way to think about it. Let me basically give you a shortcut way to do this. Okay, if you're subtracting bigger from, and then subtracting smaller from it, this is normal subtraction. The answer is always positive. If you're doing a subtraction of positive numbers like this, and you have a smaller number minus a bigger number, then what's going to end up happening is you're always going to subtract the numbers like normal, subtract the bigger number minus the smaller number, no matter which one first, and you're just going to end up slapping a negative on the front. Notice that 4 minus 3 is 1. It's negative because this guy is the smaller number in the front. 3 minus 1 gives me 2, but it's negative because I started off with a smaller number. 8 minus 5 is 3, so I put a 3, but it's negative because of the fact that I had the smaller number in front. So if you're ever subtracting numbers, and the first one happens to be smaller, then you can just do a regular subtraction and just stick a negative on the front. So however you like to do it. If you like to draw number lines, draw a number line. You'll never get the wrong answer. If you like to convert the problem over into the addition form because you memorized how to do these, that's fine. Do that. I promise you, though, that over time you will get very, very used to this, and you won't even think about it. When you see 5 minus 12, you'll know what to do. So let's go on to another case, which again, I told you, you've seen all of these, or a lot of these. So this is going to be something you've seen before, but you may not realize it right away. Here we did positive minus positive. Let's do negative minus positive. Negative number minus a positive number. So the example that we might have there would be something like negative 3 minus 4. So here's a negative 3, that's a negative number. We're subtracting a positive number from it. And what I want to point out to you, though, before we even get to this is the same as something you've already seen before. It's the same as negative 3 plus negative 4. Because remember, I told you, anytime you see plus and negative, it's the same thing as subtraction. And we have done this type of problem. We have done that type of problem in the last section, adding two integers together. And I told you, anytime you have a negative plus a negative, the answer is always negative. So you add them together, which is 7, and you stick a negative out front. The answer is negative 7. So the answer to this problem, which is exactly the same thing, is negative 7. Now, to understand where that's coming from, let's draw it on a number line. Okay, let's say this is 0 here. Negative 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, negative 6, and negative 7. And let's say that I'm starting off at negative 3 because that's how my problem is. I start here and I have to take away 4 from that. So I go this way. 1, 2, 3, 4. Negative 7. Okay, now let's try another quick problem that would fit this mold. So let's say we had negative 1 minus 5. Negative 1 minus 5. Well, if you can kind of visualize that number line, you're going to have negative 1, and you're going to subtract 5 more. So you're going to be getting this way. You're going to be going this way, even more negative. So you're going to be at negative 6 when it's all over. And just to refresh your memory, that's because you're going to, if this is 0, negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, and negative 6 over here, then if you were going to do something like this, you'd be starting at negative 1. This is the starting point, and you're going to subtract 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you're going to land on negative 6. So just as we said before, we're going to be going more and more negative. Let's do one more quick one like this. So negative 2 minus 8. Well, if you can visualize negative 2 being here on the number line, and you're going to go 8 more to the left, you're going to be sliding this way. So you're going to end up on negative 10. So you're adding these numbers together, and you're sticking a negative sign. Same thing we're doing here. Same thing we're doing here. We're just adding them up and putting a negative. And that's because it's exactly the same thing as negative 2 plus a negative 8. And we said, an addition of negative plus negative, we just add the numbers together, and we stick a negative sign on there. So I don't think I need to draw the number line again, because you can imagine if you were over here at negative 2, you would count 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. You're going to land at negative 10. All right, so there's one more case that we're going to cover. All right, and this is the one case that's really new. This is one of the cases that's really new. So what is it going to be? It's going to be the case of if we have a positive number minus a negative number, or a negative number minus a negative number. Up until this point, we've never subtracted a negative number. We've subtracted numbers, and we've done things with negative numbers, but we've never had a case where we subtracted a negative number. So it's not very difficult. Let's just look at what it would look like. Let's say we had 5 minus a negative 3. So this is what it would look like. You know that you're subtracting something because there's a negative minus sign here, but the quantity that you're subtracting is a negative number. Now, let me ask you a question. So we're subtracting something negative. We already talked about this a lot in this course. A negative number is nothing more than if you don't have that many of something, you actually owe that many to somebody else. So, if I have, 2 markers here, the regular old subtraction from first grade, if I have 2 markers, and I say 2 minus 1. Well, we know that we have 2 markers to begin with. We take 1 away, and we're left with 1 marker left over. That's basic math, right? But if we have 2 markers, let's say, like this, and we subtract a negative number, what does that even mean? Because if I have 2 markers, I know what it means if I subtract markers away. That makes sense. But what if I'm subtracting a negative number of markers? That means I'm not subtracting a real number of markers that I have in front of me. I'm subtracting the amount of markers that you owed me or something like that. It doesn't even make total sense. So it's almost like in the English language, which you're never supposed to do this. You're never supposed to speak like this. We're taught not to speak like this. But what happens if you say something like, okay, if you say, I don't want bananas. I don't want bananas. What does that mean? It means you don't want any bananas. So don't give me any bananas, right? But what if you say, I don't not want any bananas? I don't not want any bananas. Well, the don't and the not, which are both sort of negative statements, they kind of cancel each other out. And so in the end, you really do want bananas in that case. So think about this for a second. This is important. Okay, I don't not want, let's just say pencils. All right? So if someone does not want something, or if someone not want something, when you not want something, it means don't give it to me. But if I don't not want something, then in fact it means you actually do want something. The two negatives kind of cancel out. Now we're never supposed to make sentences that look like this. So that's a big no-no. But what I'm trying to say is that a negative statement multiplied here, or sitting next to another negative statement, basically cancels out. And so you have a positive statement. I don't not want any French fries. That doesn't even make any sense, but if you think hard enough about it, I think you can convince yourself that it means I really do want French fries if I say that. Of course, you never would say it that way. So the bottom line, what I'm trying to get at here is if you have a negative and subtracting a negative number, this is basically like a negative statement and a negative statement right next to each other. So anytime you see subtracting a negative like this, you're going to hear this term a lot. It's called add the opposite. So what you're going to end up doing is basically these two negative things, they sort of cancel out and you end up with something positive. So the way you would do that is, if you had this guy here, is you would take your pencil literally on your paper and you would, let me change colors. You would put a plus here and a plus here. So you make it 5 plus 3. So this is now 5 plus 3, and that's equal to 8. So make sure you really understand what I'm trying to say here, because this is something you're going to need to know. Anytime you subtract a negative number, anytime you subtract a negative variable or something like that, if you know it's negative, these two negative signs are basically kind of cancel out, just like they do here in the English language. So if you have a negative and you're subtracting a negative number, you're going to end up adding the opposite. So when we say adding the opposite, we put a plus here that means adding the opposite sign from what we had initially. So we put a plus here and a plus here. So it just changes it into something very easy. 5 plus 3. You know how to do that. So let's go ahead and do a few more just to make sure you kind of get it. If you have 6 minus a negative 2, anytime you subtract a negative number, you simply add the opposite. So that's going to be 6 plus 2, which is also 8. Okay? What if you had 3 minus a negative 1? Well, anytime you have subtracting a negative number, you're going to add the opposite. And so this is going to be 3 plus 1 is equal to 4. And what if we had negative 4 minus negative 6? We have subtracting a negative number, we're going to add the opposite. So what we're going to have here is negative 4 plus 6. Now we still have to do this addition, which we've learned in the last section when we're adding integers here. So we're going to basically, because one of them's negative and one of them's positive, we always subtract these guys. So 6 minus 4 is 2, and we're going to take the sign of the larger absolute value, so it's positive. So negative 4 plus 6 is 2. So make sure you understand that. I mean, if you remember back way up here, I told you, anytime you're adding a negative number, it's the same thing as subtraction. That's just a rule you're going to have to remember. If you're adding a negative number, it's the same thing as subtracting the number. If you're subtracting a negative number, when you're going to end up adding the opposite, it's basically going to change into a plus sign. And that is just, I've tried to explain it a few different ways so that you kind of understand it, but you're just essentially going to have to memorize that. But don't stare at the video until you memorize it. Just work these problems. Play the section back 2 or 3 times if you have to after this viewing, and then next time you come through, start pausing the video as you go through and start trying to work them yourself and then see if you're correct. It's the best way to do this. There's no amount of staring in a book that's going to make it simple for you. It's just a matter of doing the problem. So we are going to solidify this just a little bit more with a couple of additional little guys here. What if I had negative 10 minus negative 3? Nothing special. Doesn't matter if this is negative 10 there or not. If I have these two negatives close to each other, I'm going to add the opposite. And so I'm going to have negative 10 plus 3. And negative 10 plus 3, we talked about this. We're adding two integers. One's negative, one's positive. We always subtract. 10 minus 3 is 7. And the larger integer absolute value is going to take the sign of the answer. So we get negative 7 there. And then one final one before we do our whole bit of practice, negative 5 minus a negative 1. Negative 5 minus negative 1. So again, we have two guys, so we're going to add the opposite. And so we have, in the end, negative 5 plus 1. And so we're adding two integers. One is negative, one's positive, so we subtract them. 5 minus 1 is 4, and the sign is going to come from the larger absolute value. So you have negative 4 for the answer. So if you want to talk about cars, I don't not want a car means I want a car. So that's basically what that amounts to. So let's briefly look over this stuff, and then we'll work a bunch of problems. Positive minus positive. First grade math. If the first number is bigger, you just subtract them, just like you normally do, and you get positive numbers for the answer. That's the subtraction you've always done before. If you have positive minus positive where it's flipped around, where the first one's actually smaller, then you do the exact same thing. You still subtract them. Whatever number is bigger, just go ahead and subtract them, but you're going to have to stick a negative sign on the front because you're going to be going on the other side of 0 there. That's something you'll just have to get used to. So anytime you do see a subtraction of positive numbers, you are going to subtract the numbers, but you'll have to remember what sign to put on the front. And you'll get it with practice. All right. The next case is if you have a negative minus a positive, then basically, a negative minus a positive number, then if you look here, negative 3 minus 4, you're just starting at negative 3 and you're making it even more negative. So you're going to end up adding these numbers together like that and sticking a negative on. And that is also because it can be rewritten exactly like this, plus negative, which is what we did in the last section, right? And the final case is if we have positive minus negative or negative minus negative, anytime you have minus a negative number, you need to add the opposite. And then you just follow the rules that we've been studying in the previous couple of sections. Okay, so that was a good introduction. I wanted to go through the cases. I want to make sure you understood where we stand on that. And now what I want to do is just work a ton of problems, because the only way you really get good at this is problems. So let's go ahead and do that. What if we had 7 minus 3? That's first grade math. 7 minus 3 is 4. Right? Now what if we had 3 minus 7? 3 minus 7. So this is something from this case. We talked about it, positive minus positive. We just do the subtraction. We're going to get 4. But since the first number is smaller, we have to stick a negative out front. Because we're starting at 3 and we're going left 7, so we're going on the other side of 0. And that's really the reason graphically. What if we had 5 minus 1? Well, you know 5 minus 1 is 4. What if we had 1 minus 5? Well, it's the same thing. We're subtracting them, so we still put a 4, but we have to stick a negative on there because we're subtracting, and the first number is actually smaller. So you'll see a pattern to my problems here. 8 minus 7 is 1, and 7 minus 8 is negative 1. Same exact thing. I'm just doing a bunch of these so you see. 12 minus 4 is 8. And 4 minus 12 is negative 8. So we still do the subtraction, we just have to stick that negative out front because the smaller number is actually here in the front. Number 9, 11 minus 6 is 5. And 6 minus 11 is negative 5. Okay? So that was a really good ton of problems basically dealing with our first little case. Our first couple of cases, and let's do a few more in that same exact type of problem. What if I had Actually, this is a slightly different kind of problem. Case number 2. So what if we had negative 2 minus 4? We're starting with a negative. We're subtracting even more from it. So we're going to get more negative. So 2 plus 4 gives me 6, and we have to stick a negative out front. So this is going to be more negative because we're starting negative and we're taking more away. All right. Now what if we have negative 3 minus 5? Same thing. We're starting at negative 3. We're taking 5 away. So this is going to be negative 8. We're adding these numbers and we're sticking a negative out front. For 13, what if I had negative 8 minus 1? It's going to be negative 9 because we're basically adding these numbers and sticking a negative out front because we're sliding farther to the left along the number line. What if we had, for 14, what if we had negative 5 minus 6? Well, it's the same thing. We're going to have 11, but we're going to have to stick a negative out because we're going that direction. 15 is negative 1 minus 15. So it's the same thing. We add these guys together, we stick a negative out front, so negative 16. Problem number 16, negative 8 minus 10. So it's the same thing. We're starting negative and we're taking more away, so it's going to be 18 and a negative sign out front. So that's a good chunk of problems. Let's keep working some more. So let's go ahead and draw a little line here between them and switch colors just to liven the board up a little bit. What if we have, different case, for 17, what if we have 1 minus a negative 2? 1 minus a negative 2. See if I can use some different colors here to help us. Well, because we have subtracting a negative sign, we're basically going to add the opposite. So this is going to be 1 plus 2, because you have a plus now, and that's going to equal 3, positive 3. Positive 3. Now, let's say for number 18, we have 1 minus a negative 5. 1 minus negative 5. So we have subtracting a negative, so we add the opposite. And so what we're going to have is 1 plus 5, because this is now plus, and that's equal to 6. Okay, and 19, let's say we have 6 minus a negative 9. So we have subtracting a negative, we'll add the opposite. And so this is going to be 6 plus 9, and now that's going to be 15. All right, so let's say we have 2 minus negative 2. Again, we have subtracting a negative, so we add the opposite, and we'll have 2 plus 2 is 4. Okay, now what if we had 21? 7 minus a negative 3. So we will add the opposite because we have those negatives together, and it will be 7 plus 3 is equal to 10. So that's sort of our other case that we had. And let's just work a few more where the first number is negative. There's nothing magical about these. I'm just trying to cover all the cases so you see a bunch of problems of all types. Negative 1 minus negative 2. It doesn't matter if this first number is negative. You handle it the same. These negatives are right next to each other, so I can add the opposite. And so I'm going to have negative 1, because of this negative 1, plus 2, because this becomes a plus. Now you have to think, okay, how do I add these integers? Negative 1 plus 2. Well, they're different signs, so thinking back to the last section, we have to subtract them. 2 minus 1 is 1, and the sign is going to come from the larger absolute value, so he stays positive. So you're going to have a positive 1 there. All right, actually, this was problem number 22. So 23, let's say, is negative 7 minus negative 6. And so same thing, we have the two negatives together, we have to add the opposite. And so what I'm going to have is negative 7 from this plus, because this is now plus 6. And negative 7 plus 6, you have to think about this in terms of you're adding two opposite signs. So you always end up subtracting in that case, and the answer is going to be 1, but the sign is going to come from the larger absolute value, so it's going to be negative 1. 24 is negative 9 minus negative 5. We're going to add the opposite here because those are right next to each other, and you're going to have negative 9 plus 5. And adding these guys together, you have opposite signs, so we're going to end up subtracting. 9 minus 5 gives us 4, and the sign comes from the larger absolute value, so we have negative 4 there. All right, and then 25. Let's say we have negative 9 minus negative 3, right? And so we're going to add the opposite there, the two negatives. Negative 9 plus 3 is what we're going to have left over. And then you have to do that subtraction, and then, or that addition of numbers. We're going to subtract these, so 9 minus 3 gives us 6. The sign comes from the larger absolute value. And finally, last problem of this type, problem 26, negative 11 minus negative 15. Same thing, add the opposite, and then we're going to go ahead and change this around. We'll have negative 11 plus 15. So we're going to do the same thing here. We're going to end up adding these, but because one of them is negative, we'll subtract them. 15 minus 11 is 4, and the sign comes from the larger absolute value, so it stays at 4. Now, you have to forgive me for doing so many problems of this type. It's just because you really have to master it. I mean, there's no other way to say it. You have to get this, because if you don't, you're just going to be confused. And if you feel like you kind of get it now, do yourself a favor and play this section again and practice these problems and do as many times. It doesn't matter if you've seen them before. Do it as many times as it takes so that you can finally get these right. Because even if you think you're cheating a little bit because you've seen them before, it's going to help you.